Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm going to talk about perhaps evolution, perhaps abiogenesis, and perhaps other things with my guest today. So, why don't you introduce yourself?
My name is Rick Holtzclaw.
And so, are you into
Can you hear me?
apologetics? I heard you say your name, Rick. Okay.
Rick.
So you're into like creation, evolution, that kind of stuff?
Creation. I don't believe in evolution. I think evolution is a lie. It's a facade. It's something that has been cast upon mankind. It has been bastardized by the progressive elites. It's been infused in our school system. I went through the public education system up through a mass, and I watched the deception in our school. And after 31 years in law enforcement, with the human evolution has done to our society, there is zero proof for evolution. It's historical science. Basically, men look at the present, they make inferences about the past. Evolution is not subject to empiricism. It is not subject to the scientific method. It cannot be tested. It is a guess. It is mankind's best guess. The purpose for evolution, as it has been in society today, is to nullify the Genesis account of creation. In atheism, is in a pot. Evolution gives birth to atheism. In atheism, gives birth to nihilism. And eventually atheism gives birth to the death of the body and death of the soul. And there is nothing that you can is going to convince me that evolution is true. Now, there's probably nothing I could show you that would convince you that is
That's not true.
But
that's not true.
Oh, really? Okay, well, I have debated atheists, and I have presented to atheists left and right, but they don't seem to accept it.
Go
ahead.
The sound is a little bit spotty from time to time. I think I caught the majority of it. You sounded fine for most of it, and then it was a little bit spotty right at the end. But I think I heard. I think it kind of caught up. So well, yes, I do have. I'm sorry.
I am, like I say, I'm on satellite internet. We have rain moving through the area. I'm up in North, so I may not be able to stay in contact with you.
Okay, let me see. Let me go to the. I forgot to open up the page, the watch page, where people are seeing. How are you guys hearing us? I don't know. Whoops. Okay, it'll load in a sec. Anyways, so so you said evolution is a lie. So what is your definition of evolution? That's where I want to start, really.
I don't believe separate abiogenesis. It is all the same. Can you hear me?
I missed the first part of it. I heard you say evolution and abiogenesis, and then that was it.
Yeah, this is going to be difficult to do because I can't keep a constant conversation. You're breaking up also very badly.
Oh, man. I'm sorry to hear that. Well, I might delete this stream afterwards if we can't really hear each other. So, okay, so what is your definition of evolution?
There is no definition of evolution. It's false.
So if I were to tell you change in allele frequency in a population over generations is the definition of evolution, why is that not the definition of evolution?
Because we have no proof that has ever occurred. Zero proof that has ever occurred.
Whoa. Okay, wow. So you know what alleles are, right? Can you hear me?
Barely. You're breaking up.
So
really
do you know
bad.
okay? Do you know what alleles are?
What you're basically speaking of is that through mutation, species will change into another species, basically, if given enough time. Through mutation, through adaptation, we will see
Recombination,
one
genetic drift,
species
gene
basically.
flow.
Right.
Um,
None of that has ever
so
been
actually, it has both in the
where.
field and in the laboratory.
Really?
Yes.
What can you show me? Can you show me evidence of macroevolution?
Well, first of all, I mean, yes, I can actually. Again, that's another point where the definition is crucial to understanding what this phenomenon is. Do you know what the definition of what is your definition of macroevolution?
Where one species becomes a wholly different species over time.
Okay. Okay, that's a really good definition. That's pretty close to what I would say is genetic change at or above the level of species. So I'd say we're dealing with about the same definition of macroevolution that has been observed both actually really in the fossil record and in lab experiments and in the field. The idea of speciation is the idea of speciation is so well accepted. I actually have all 4 of the Answers in Genesis Answers books, and they have at least one chapter where they say, yeah, speciation happens. We're fine with that. I mean, that definitely does happen. Even the other creationists are okay with this.
Yeah, what you're calling speciation, for instance, is where the waters become muddied between creationist and evolutionist is the difference between species and kind. It grows a little muddy there because Darwin changed kind to species, and then things start to get complicated. For instance, let's take the horse kind, for example. Of the horse kind, we see a donkey, we see a zebra, we see a mule, and we see a horse. Now, the biblical definition is they are all one kind. Darwin, they are different species. That the zebra is a species of the horse. The mule is a species of a horse and a donkey. It's a hybrid because it doesn't reproduce, basically. It's a hybrid. Right. But we would say that those are all of the same kind. They will not reproduce outside of their kind.
Okay.
And no add to that.
Sorry. To add to that.
Go ahead. So what I'm trying to say.
I think there's a lag.
Okay.
Sorry.
Your turn. Sorry. Your turn. Go ahead.
I was going to say, are you familiar with David Kavanaugh? He's a young Earth creationist who works for Answers in Genesis.
David Kavanaugh. The name sounds familiar.
Todd Wood, Kurt Wise. You familiar with them?
I think so. I think I've read some of their work.
Todd Wood was in Is Genesis History that came out a few years ago. He was one of the guys they talked to. I think he dealt with animals in that one. All 3 of them, Kurt Wise, David Kavanaugh, Todd Wood, they wrote a paper on the horse kind, the equid kind, where they say everything from the modern horse and zebras and all that, all the way down to the little dog-sized Hyracotherium were all one kind. Right? So we have everything like Mesohippus, Pliohippus. We don't see what?
Do we see that in the geological evidence?
Yeah, we
see. Do we have any?
Yeah, there's like the little Hyracotherium at the very base of the tree. They have 5 little toes, and they're they have different tooth structure. Then they lose the outer toes. You have Mesohippus, which has the 3, and then then you lost. Eventually, you have Pliohippus or whatever, and they lost it, and they just have the 1 toe. And so yeah, you can see the slow progression of the loss of toes.
But in the geological, in our geological studies, do we have any transitional fossils that show this?
Yeah. I mean, we have the horse, we have the Hyracotherium with 5, and then Mesohippus with 3, and then Pliohippus with 1 toe. And so you can see the loss.
Well, but I mean, how do we know that these transitional fossils belong to this group?
Well, they all have the suite of features that modern horses also have. They have a certain molar or root tooth structure. They have, a certain ankle structure, which is the perissodactyls. And so they have all these synapomorphies, which unite them with modern horses, and even Cavanon, Wood, and Wise they all say, okay, horses are horses. Everything from Hyracotherium up to Equus, the modern Equus, they were all one kind. Mm-hmm. They were all related to each other. And so, yeah, we do see that record. There's a lot of really interesting papers. I think Prothero's written some papers on it, and there are others. He's just the first one who came to mind.
Do we have that we have all come from a common ancestor?
Do we have that we all came from a common ancestor?
Do we have that we all have come from a common ancestor?
Well, let's see. We have we are primates. We have all the synapomorphies of primates. And so when you look at the basal primates on the tree, things like you have Plesiadapiformes and Adapiformes, which are way down at the bottom of the primate tree near the guys like lemurs, lorises, those sorts of things. And prior to them, you have little shrew-like guys like Purgatorius, who's I think late Cretaceous. And so then prior to that, you have a whole bunch of these little shrew-like guys because dinosaurs were still alive at the time. And so there's a whole bunch of these little mammals who look like shrews because they had yet to undergo their rapid diversification at the start of the Cenozoic, which gave rise to all the modern groups, the elephants, horses, rhinos, things like that. And so we can see from the fossils that there are some characteristics that unite these guys, but it's mostly from genetics, from things like molecular clocks, things like that, that we, and then we can cross-calibrate that with the fossils, but it's mostly genetics that tells us our ancestors. With horses, for instance, our ancestors with a horse lived in the Cretaceous, over 80 million years ago. So,
I know that.
Can you hear me? Do what?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay. How do we know that for sure? Has it ever been observed?
What do you mean by observed? What do you mean by for sure?
Have we observed these transformations that we know for sure that occurred?
Well, you can develop a reasonable amount of assurance based on principle of parsimony, based on what we know about genetics and how we know traits are passed on from generation to generation, modified and inherited. And so when you extend that backwards, which creationists do accept for some things, but if we just extend it backwards, then we can show here's where these guys group together. And so, I mean, there's a pretty good... we have pretty good reason to acknowledge that Hyracotherium, Mesohippus, and Pliohippus are all related to the modern horse because they all have the synapomorphies of horses, and we know that synapomorphies correlate with certain genetic characteristics, and then we can test how those are modified and things like that, both in the lab and observe it in the field. But no one was around, for instance. No, go ahead.
How do you observe it? How do you observe evolution in the field?
So, like I said, evolution is changing allele frequency. For instance, in a population over generations. So, for instance, you can. Have you ever heard of the lizard?
You're breaking up. Say again.
Have you ever heard of the lizards of Podmorkaru?
No.
So there's the Adriatic.
I've never heard of it.
Okay. So over in the Adriatic Sea, you have these islands One is called
Mhm.
Pod Copiste, and on this island and in the area,
Mhm.
there are these lizards called Podarcus sicula, which is the Italian wall lizard. And so researchers in the 19 or 70s, I think it was, took a small population of these lizards, Podarcus sicula, from and to this island that didn't have any lizards, any of this species called Podmocaru. In just 20 years, these lizards developed a whole suite of characteristics because their diet had shifted. They've gone from being primarily insectivorous to being primarily herbivorous. They developed a larger head. Their bite is now, which correlates with how they bite plants. They have this new little valve called a cecal valve in their gut, which helps them digest plant material. So we can see that biogeography, when you move organisms from one place to another and they acquire characteristics depending on their new location, we can see that in human years.
But what does that have to do with evolution? Why isn't that just genetic information that was already on the genome? They're simply adapting to their environment. Evolution says that through evolution clearly demands that through mutation that information is added and that these animals or they become a completely different. They are just adapting to what is already on their genome. So how is that a sign of evolution?
So in a lot of cases, evolution work. In fact, I would say most, if not all, of evolution. It's in all of evolution is modifications of the genetic code. In some ways, the one example I was thinking of, there's this process called exaptation, where you basically have a gene and it's doing some function, and modify that gene such that it's now doing a different job than it previously was. Right. For instance, you have ice fish in the one second. So you have, for instance, ice fish, and they have neo-functionalized one of their genes, which was for making trypsinogen, which is a protein in the pancreas. But now the protein, the gene, was duplicated a bunch of times, and it now specifies antifreeze in their veins. That's why they're ice fish. And so it just adapted this gene that they already had for a new function.
But that's not evolution. That's just adaptation. That's genetic material that's genetic material that was already on the genome.
Okay, so let me ask it this way.
They didn't create that. It was already present.
So I have to ask then, how would you expect that evolution would create genetic material?
It doesn't.
Hello?
That's why evolution. Can you hear me?
Yeah, okay. I heard you say it doesn't, but that's not what I asked. That's not an answer to the question.
It is an answer. You're asking me how can evolution create
but I don't
genome
think it does.
information? It doesn't.
I don't think it does. I agree.
It doesn't.
Because that's not what it's about.
It simply uses the information that was already programmed on the genome.
Right.
It was already there.
Right. Exactly.
That's not
it's
evolution.
Like asking. That is absolutely evolution. I mean, imagine if I were to ask you, how do you modify something that doesn't exist? You say that's nonsense. You can't modify something that doesn't exist. That's precisely what you're asking me to do.
Okay, let's take this for instance. Abiogenesis, or molecules to man evolution, declares that we all came from non-life, from lifeless material. Somehow, we just formed into this very simplistic genome. But this simplistic genome, over millions or billions of years, evolved into sophisticated, through mutation, evolved into some sophisticated man and beast and plants. How did that happen with just a genome? How did that happen? How did that occur?
So in this conversation, Sensei Biogenesis doesn't have to do with evolution. I'm willing to concede, for instance, that let's take a deistic approach. I'm willing to say God snapped his fingers and the first cell came into existence and then left it alone after that. We still have to deal with evolution, even if I concede that.
Okay.
Right. And so,
all right.
I mean, you look at something like,
how did we with that one?
How did we with that one?
No,
How did we with that one? What? You can go ahead. You can ask your question. Can you hear me? I can't hear anything. Can you guys hear anything? Is it my internet? Hello? Can you hear me?
I was just trying to listen. There's a lag.
Okay, well, yeah, I couldn't hear anything on that. I'm not sure if it's my computer or what. But you can ask your question. You were saying how something.
Can you still hear me?
Oh, I can hear you now. I just heard you ask that. Okay, I can hear you again. Okay, so ask your question. You were saying how can
if our Lord lied to us, if Genesis is not true, then let's take, for instance, your scenario that our God left one genome here. How did we, through one simplistic genome, evolve into the complexity of life that we see now?
So, what or how things adapted to their environment and changed and things like that. There are lots of different processes that can affect those changes. For instance, I've been reading some interesting literature recently on the origin of multicellularity. So there are actually a number of different reasons why multicellularity could have originally occurred. One of the there are, for instance, there's predation. Predation could have forced a group of unicellular organisms together, and then what they have to achieve essentially a unicellular phase in their development where they unify their genetics so that they all have essentially the same genes, so they're not trying to compete against each other. And so there are parts, there are like things that are like a cell-to-cell signaling and the stuff for the proteins for programming cell death and cell adhesion. All these things were co-opted. The like cell-to-cell signaling mechanisms like receptor tyrosine kinases in animals, they're also in choanoflagellates, which are they're unicellular protists, and they're very closely related to animals, right? They're the protists most closely related to animals. And so even though these guys are unicellular, they have the same kind of cellular machinery as us, but they're using it for a different purpose. Now, this sort of stuff is adapted or exapted into a new function. And so that's just one way. Now, there's also mutations where some gene which is doing some job gets mutated, and it now is slightly better at that job, or it's doing a slightly different job or something like that. Those are just two different ways things can change. Does that answer your question?
So what you're saying is that this simplistic genome, which overwhelmingly loses information, it through mutation has evolved into the complexity of the in our body. Did I lose you?
I heard you. You said, how does it evolve into the modern complexity, right? That's your question, is how does it...
Right.
These changes come about? Well, there's actually... there's a whole lot of literature for each of the different little systems in our body, like our brain, like our lungs, our limbs, things like that. And there are these very intimate explanations of these things. For instance, like our cardiovascular system, for instance, it's understood that there were primordial myocytes in the common was it the common ancestor? No, it wasn't the common ancestor of all animals. It was shortly after, and so how that diversified. It took on this primordial myocyte came to become eventually our whole system, the whole cardiovascular system. Sorry, the muscular system, not cardiovascular system. I don't know what I was thinking when I said that. And so there are these explanations. You can look at modern phylogenetics. You can look at morphology. You can. You don't really have a whole lot of fossils for early animals, but you can look at these different things and they kind of cross-check each other. And so we can build this understanding of how these different features came about. Limbs are a really good example of that because they're modified fins. And so you've got these early fish, these early osteichthyans, such as I think Lophosteus is one of them, Emania, Aquania. These are all basal osteichthyans. And you get the Sarcopterygians, who are the lobe-finned fish, and we have basal members of them, like Gyu, like the Onychodonts, and they just modify their fin. Eventually, the fin is modified such that it can do kind of grabbing mechanisms, and it eventually becomes a load-bearing, and so that's how you get the first tetrapods, the first critters who can walk around on land.
And you truly believe that?
Well, I can show it. It's actually, that very model has been used to make predictions, which have been verified.
It is a guess. Nobody was
it's
there.
It's not a guess. It doesn't. So okay.
It's a guess. No one was there.
Aren't you?
Tell me something.
I'm sorry. I think it lagged again. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
You said tell me something. That was what I heard. That was the last thing I heard.
Tell me something. Tell me how do we know this? Because no one was there. And even if your model was somehow correct, where did logic and reason and morality?
So the first question that you asked is, how did it happen if no one was there? So you worked with Houston PD, right? Or for Houston PD.
Right. Yes.
I'm sure you were familiar with detectives. So detectives,
yes.
A lot of times in crimes, no one was around to see the criminal. No one was around to see the criminal shoot somebody or something like that, right? And so you have to construct what happened based on the data that you have, whether fingerprints or blood samples or hair samples or maybe their credit card purchases. If you have a suspect, something like that. So you use all these methods that aren't simply identifying by eyewitness the perpetrator. And so the same sort of process is going on in evolutionary biology. You have all this data, the genetics, which points to modern amphibians being the most basal tetrapods. You have lungfish and coelacanths, who are both modern sarcopterygians, who have features that we share or they have a number of features we share in common. Then you look at the fossil record, and we also have huge sets of stem tetrapodiforms, like Rhipidistia, that's one of them. Connecthes, all these other guys. These guys have internal choanae, the nostrils, nostril cavity, like we have in common. And then the great part is it allows us to make predictions. Once you get a large enough data set, you should be able to make predictions about what we should find next. Because that's what a good model does. That's what a really good scientific theory does. We should be able to predict what we're going to find tomorrow. So with this model, you ever heard of Neil Shubin?
No.
So Neil Shubin is a paleontologist who works up in Chicago, and he and a team predicted that there should be a Sarcopterygian, like a lobe-finned fish, with tetrapod characteristics in a specific strata on Earth, which they determined was in Devonian strata of Canada. So they went to Canada and they dug and they found a fish with tetrapod characteristics, which they named Tiktaalik rosier. And so this is a definite prediction of their model. This is a verified prediction of their model, I should say. So what are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are that it is a worldview. 1 and 1 become 3. It doesn't exist. They don't know. They are simply making messes about cannot confirm. It is all based on a worldview. No vacation. Even if all of that were to be true, does logic come from? Reason come from? Where does morality come from? Where do we find these things? How did they appear in?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a valid question. I really do. But I think it's more important to answer how evolution works and understand the foundation for evolution, things like this, before we can get into things like consciousness and logic and morality. Even though we do know, for instance, that, and I'm not a philosophically minded person. I'm crap at philosophy. You can ask anybody who knows me, right? I don't know a lot about philosophy, but what I can see is that, I mean, in the case of logic, for instance, we do have a progression of logic that's been written down in books over the years. We've seen from the pre-Socratics, Plato, Aristotle. We have seen, the Middle Eastern scholars. We've seen this progression of logic, and so we have the logic we have now. The mathematic kind of logic is very different than what they had back then because it has progressed so much. I mean, that's just one example. Morality, some parts of morality. I'm sorry?
It's been logic. It doesn't matter if you add to interpolate or extrapolate it from a mathematical perspective. Logic has always been logic. So how did this logic, how did this reason find its way into from this simplistic genome? And how did this genome know how to exist? And where did it get all of the different elements necessary for it from the environment? What told this genome to take in certain nutrients, to play or progress that way? And then how did it, without the genetic information already being on, it wasn't on a simplistic genome? How did these things occur?
So what tells an organism, or other organisms at least, to do things is determined primarily. I mean, you wouldn't say, for instance, that an amoeba thinks about gathering nutrients, right?
That from where? And how did it learn in order to do this? And then how did it become?
It didn't have to learn.
Well, it had to have the info for it to begin to. Where did that information come from?
When you say information, what is your meaning by that?
Genome. How did it have the information to begin to adapt to its environment? Simplistic genome over a period of time, which there is no proof for that. And if you believe in creation, there's no reason for that. But over this billions of years, how did this simple genome begin to form into all of the complexity of life? And where did it learn to do that? How was the information added? I'm not quite following you on this. Genome can have information added to it by mutation.
Okay, so um, I'm confused when you use. I think the word "learn" is used incorrectly in this context. The genome doesn't learn to do anything ever. It has never learned. No organism's genome has ever learned to do anything. No population, uh, because what happens to the genome is not under our control and not under our conscious control. Genomes are mutated in every generation. You don't tell your genome to make lactase so you can break down lactose. You don't tell your body to do that. Your body just knows to do that.
Right, but
Unless
doesn't
you're
it
lactose
duplicate
intolerant.
itself? Doesn't it learn from the function
Does it
itself?
learn from the function?
And then it duplicates itself?
I mean, yes, organisms reproduce, and all organisms reproduce. How that got started is a question that I'll be first to tell you. Nobody knows how reproduction first got started in under evolution. All that. That's a very interesting question. It's one that they're looking into, but even if we never solve it, it still doesn't make all the data within evolution go away. I mean, for instance, you're aware that, and because we keep talking about genomes learning things. Are you aware that amoeba have over 16 times as many genes as we have?
But how did they get those genes from a simplistic genome? Where did that information come from?
Okay, so you can have things like duplications. Duplications are a pretty well understood mechanism of evolution. I gave you the example of the ice fish earlier. You have a gene for trypsinogen, which is a protein,
how do you get duplication? How do you get duplication from a simplistic genome?
So if you have like a what is it called, slippage or whatever, if like your genome doesn't intentionally duplicate, if you have a genetic duplication, which is a mutation, your genome doesn't consciously do that. It's an accident, essentially. Your body, or your germ, whatever, it's in your germ cell, and so your body is not consciously doing that. It just happens by accident. It's a total accident that happens. It's really not supposed to happen, but these things do happen, and they can be acted upon by natural selection, by sexual selection, these other genetic drift, these other mechanisms, and then they can eventually become something new. Like the ice fish who duplicated the trypsinogen gene, or you mutated it and then duplicated it, no part of that was conscious. It was just happening because it was necessary in their environment, helped them survive slightly, and so they adapted, and it was also adapted, or it was changed as they adapted, and so no part of it is just happens essentially by accident. That's the word people like to use. I think it's useful in this context, but it's essentially just an accident, an accident of the genetic to fix these sorts of things, and we can show that happens.
So what you're saying is this. So what you're saying is this simplistic genome, just by accident, began to duplicate itself. Basically, we don't know how that happened.
Well, there would have likely been a population of them would have somehow to reproduce and produce, and they can pass on it. So that would have been the one to survive and would have. So right, essentially, that's what would have happened.
So the key word there is possible. Is that correct? The key word is that it possibly could have happened. We don't know that.
We don't know. We don't know what the first.
We don't know. So why?
We don't know how it first started.
Why is it just as reasonable that God made man after His own image, and man began to reproduce after His own image, and was given this genome that is particularly man's, and God didn't start over with every creative entity. We do share certain basic elemental characteristics with nature itself. That just simply shows that we have a creator who didn't start over. He just simply used the genetic information that was there. But why does this possibility of this genome just happening to come from non-living matter, which we don't know how that happened? Why is that more logical to you than God having created man?
For the problem with this conversation of how did reproduction start is that's abiogenesis solution. So evolution is far more well established than the mechanisms of abiogenesis, and I say that because we have a number of different lines of evidence that we can point to that indicate that we are in fact highly derived apes, that we share a common ancestor with other apes. We can use that to make predictions, and there are numerous tests on that. And so,
that's not true.
Again, actually, it is. I can demonstrate that we have.
We only share about 70% of our chromosome or our DNA are very similar, about 70% to an ape. That there's no way to make that leap that we evolved from an ape. You can't do that.
Do you know how traits are inherited and modified? Uh-oh, can you hear me?
You're breaking up.
I'm breaking up again. Can you hear me now? Okay. So
yes.
Can you you know that traits are inherited, right? And that they're modified.
Yes.
So what prevents us from tracking that backwards through time, which we can do? What prevents us from showing that humans and other apes are
there is nothing in that even should suggest that nothing.
I'm sorry, it kind of broke up there. Can you say again?
There are no transitory fossils which suggest that we evolved from man. There's always been a man.
Are you familiar with the
Australopithecine sequence? Has always been a rat. I'm sorry.
Are you familiar with the Australopithecine sequence?
I have read a bit on that, but
so
we did
are you familiar with all this anatomy that they share with us?
Well, the fact is, it didn't evolve from an ape. There is no ever evolved from an ape. It's not there. It's absent.
So you want fossils that show us? Because you seem to say that. Okay, so you're familiar.
There should be millions of them.
Well, we don't really have any species that has millions of fossils, and that's a problem of taphonomy, because organism or fossilization is a fairly rare process.
No.
Actually, it is, and we can again demonstrate that.
There should be.
Do you know why organisms?
No, we can't demonstrate.
Do you know why organisms don't usually die in tropical rainforests, for instance, or don't usually get fossilized in tropical rainforests, for instance?
There are no fossil evidences available to show that we have transitioned or we have anything but a man, and that God created us. There's nothing to prove that. It is all theory. It is simply a theory.
Wait. You said simply a theory. Do you know what a theory is? What is your definition of a theory?
I know how you're going to define it as a theory, but
what is atomic theory? Atomic theory, is that a theory or is that a hypothesis? Yes.
Well, where is the evidence
for atomic theory?
No, that we have evolved from an ape, other than people are scientists making inferences that we've evolved from an ape. There is no proof of that. None whatsoever. If there was, evolution wouldn't even be a debate. You can't even tell me how. You can't even tell me how we formed, how this genome formed. You have no foundation.
That's not what you
whatsoever.
Asked, though.
None.
That's not
yeah,
what you.
But you have.
Okay, there are. Okay,
no,
well, hold on. Let's
to say that our genome, the complexity of our genome, evolved from a simplistic genome. To tell me that we evolved from an ape, that is absolutely ludicrous. You have no proof of
foundational. I want to ask some foundational questions here because I'm a little confused.
Just show me evidence that man has evolved from an ape. Let me show it to me.
Have you heard of chromosomal 2?
No. And that's proven.
I'm sorry?
That has been debunked.
It actually hasn't. Jeffrey Tompkins has failed in all respects to show that our chromosome 2 doesn't have a fusion event in it. I know because I've looked at his papers and I've discussed it with geneticists, and so we can show in a whole bunch of different ways that there is a fusion in chromosome 2 that actually is a very good prediction. And Tompkins basically just ignores it. He has these. One of his charts is like he shows it. He even shows it in some of the papers he's written with Jerry Bergman that there is a fusion, and he says, "Well, it's not really." I will send you the article.
I will send you the article.
I've read his technical work on it. I've read it.
You haven't read the late has been debunked.
No, it hasn't. Even creationists are now. Even a lot of creationists I've talked to are okay with a fusion event. They just say it happened because of the fall. So actually, his work has been just obliterated. Regardless, I can show you. Are you familiar with the actual literature, the non-creationist literature on chromosome 2? Are you aware of the DDX genes, for instance?
No, I'm not.
So DDX genes are these genes that are right next to telomeres. We have a DDX gene in the middle of one of our chromosome arms. These things are telomere specific, and it's in the middle of an arm right next to the telomere sequence, the vestigial telomere sequence. He says there's like an alternate transcript that goes across the gene. It's like only very rarely expressed or whatever, or very minutely expressed. It's just complete nonsense. And he has pretty much ignored the technical literature on it to make his case. And I did a whole video on it, believe it or not. You can watch it if you want. If you check the channel, there's a link to it on my Twitter. But as for fossils, you have the entirety of the Australopithecine sequence, where they have synapomorphy shared with humans. You have other species of Homo, such as Habilis, Erectus, who again show these slow transitions. You have Heidelbergensis. We can show that we're related to Neanderthals genetically through using paleogenomics.
Let me
do what?
Listen to me.
Hello?
Your fossil evidence is a fake. It is pieces of fossils that have been put together in order to make them say something that they do not say. There is not a single transitional fossil out there for us to observe. Not one.
What's a transition fossil?
Still hear me?
Sometimes I can hear a lot of the things, but it also kind of drops out occasionally. Okay. I can hear you. Go ahead, keep talking.
In your chromosome 2, in your chromosome 2,
yeah,
it says that even though human chromosome 2, okay, listen to me. It says even though human chromosome 2 looks like it arose through a fusion event, it seems unlikely that its genesis resulted from undirected natural processes. The combining of two chromosomes to make human chromosome 2 would have required a succession of several highly events. Can you still hear me?
Who is that quoted from? Yeah. Who's that quoted from? Hello?
It is quoted from George and
George what?
JWYUNIS. It's called The Origin of Man, a Chromosomal. You can't hear me?
Say his name again.
Hold on, just for him to arise, it would have required either telomere fusion, a virtual impossibility, or fusion of an intact chromosome at its telomere end generated when another chromosome fractured near its telomere. This type of fusion can happen, but it is a rare occurrence. The event would have had to occur in the gametes, the sperm and egg cells, changing the number of chromosomes. When the chromosome number in the sperm doesn't match that of the egg, fertilization almost always results in either 1, a non-embryo, or 2, a viable offspring that suffers from a disease state, or 3, a viable but infertile offspring. Again, it is possible, but extremely rare for the resulting offspring to be viable and fertile. Finally,
polyploidy is?
Once the fusion took place between chimp chromosomes 2A and 2B, there would have to have been what evolutionary biologists call a selective sweep. This event occurs when a mutation imparts such a large advantage that it rapidly sweeps through the population, becoming fixed and reducing the genetic variability of the group. To summarize, in order for human chromosome 2 to arise from the fusion of two chromosomes, a succession of several highly improbable events would have had to have taken place. Thus, the evolutionary account of the history of human beings seems untenable. Rather, the highly unlikely nature of these events suggests to me that a creator was involved. As I have previously written, based on the biblical text, a high degree of genetic similarity, which would include similarity of chromosomes between human apes, can be expected. Could it be that the apparent fusion zones to produce human chromosome 2 tell how the creator made human beings? So,
I have for you, because I found a technical paper while you were reading that. It says, quote, this is a technical paper written in 2017 titled Chromosome-Specific Centromere Sequences Provide an Estimate of the Ancestral Chromosome 2 Fusion Event in Hominin Genomes. Quote, human chromosome 2 is a product of telomere fusion of two ancestral chromosomes and loss degeneration of one of the two original centromeres. Genomic signatures of this event are limited to inverted telomeric repeats at the precise site of chromosomal fusion and to the small amount of relic centromeric sequences that remain on 2q21.2. Unlike the site of the fusion, which is enriched for sequences that are shared elsewhere in the human genome, the region of the non-functioning and degenerate ancestral centromere appears to share limited similarity with other sites in the human genome, thereby providing an opportunity to study this genomic arrangement in short, fragmented ancient DNA genomic datasets. Here, chromosome-assigned satellite DNAs are used to study shared centromere sequence organization in Denisovan and Neanderthal genomes. By doing so, one is able to provide evidence for the presence of both active and degenerate centromeric satellite profiles on chromosome 2 in these archaic genomes, supporting the hypothesis that the chromosomal fusion event took place prior to our last common ancestor, with Denisovan and Neanderthal hominins, and presenting a genomic reference for predicting karyotype in ancient genomic datasets. So this is a paper this is a scientific technical paper. This is in the literature. This was peer reviewed, that not only acknowledges that the chromosome 2 fusion happened, which they have for over 20 years now, it also uses this in the study of comparing our DNA to other DNA of other hominins like Neanderthals and Denisovans, and allows us to make predictions about the karyotypes of other hominins. It's not a question, even among researchers, that there was a chromosomal 2 fusion. The only people who are disputing this are the fractional minority of people who are looking at the work, which is the creationists. It's a fractional minority. This is well established in the literature, in the scientific technical literature. And that's just one piece.
It's simply a hypothesis. It's a guess.
It's not a guess. Do you know what a guess? Okay, you said you used the word inference earlier, and you used theory, and you used guess.
Right.
And I asked you, I asked you, how is atomic theory just a guess? Is atomic theory a guess?
Well, I don't know that atomic theory is a guess. I don't know that atomic theory
is the theory of gravity a guess.
If your hypothesis was true, we would see a gradual change from the ape to the man, but we don't see that.
Have you heard of Oran, Ardipithecus, Sahelanthropus?
Tell me this.
Have you heard of any of those fossils?
They don't show an ape becoming
have you read about
a man.
Have you read about them?
I have seen those fossils.
Have you seen the technical
They don't show
research
anything about it. There is no technical research.
So you haven't read any technical research on hominin paleontology?
It's simply a guess. It does not exist. Even our greatest paleontologists, they have never acknowledged, not the ones who have actually admitted to the truth. They have never acknowledged a transitional fossil.
I'm glad that you bring this up because you misquoted Stephen Jay Gould while we were talking on Twitter. You brought up a quote that he said about phyletic, or it was about gradualism, because what he was talking about was phyletic gradualism. You know, he actually said that he got later in his life, he said he got really tired of creationists quote mining him on points like this. It made him very upset that they were misrepresenting his data in this way, or his papers in this way. What he was referring to in the quote that you referenced, I know this because I've read some of his work, is this thing called phyletic gradualism. So there are guys like Stephen Jay Gould, Niles Eldredge, and others worked on this stuff called tempo and mode of evolution, where they're basically trying to figure out what is the rate at which evolution proceeds, and so they did stuff, and so they compared models. There's the phyletic gradualism model, which says, you know, things are very slowly diverging, which they acknowledge. They say phyletic gradualism does happen in some cases. But their model, they were proposing a new model called punctuated equilibrium. And what this model says is that there are generally periods of stasis, generally stasis in their morphology, followed by these rapid periods of change, right? Very short periods of rapid change. And so that's what he was talking about in that quote, because for the majority of transitions, he and Eldredge and others didn't think that there was a long, slow transition. They thought it was this rapid transition. It's very fast transition of features as these things entered a new environment, and they underwent an adaptive radiation, and they developed new characters. And also because being fossilized is very hard to do. That's why we don't see a whole lot of these forms, these kind of the little transitional forms, even though we do for a lot of cases. And even he acknowledged this because he was a good paleontologist. He wrote some very good books and very good papers on this material. So that was a complete misquote, a complete misunderstanding of his research, which is common that I see. I mean, I see it a lot, but it's not really what he thought, right? He did acknowledge phyletic gradualism does happen. He said so as much regarding foraminifera, and diatoms, and those guys.
Well, but the thing is, we still don't see the changes in the fossil evidence.
Such as, such as what? If you look at, for instance, the hip, the pelvises of, compare ours with Erectus and Australopithecus afarensis and earlier species, and you can see that there's this in the way that the hip is. If you look at chimp pelvises, their pelvises are kind of like, they're very kind of long and tall, but ours are more kind of bowl shaped. And so you can look and see this gradual transition as it's kind of shortening and becoming more bowl shaped. You can compare the afarensis and Sediba and Erectus and ourselves, and you can see how it becomes more bowl shaped as opposed to taller, as this tall this tall pelvis that chimps have. You can see that. You can also see with our skull. You can, is what the term is, where it's more projecting. You can see the very slow draws back when you compare Sediba, when you compare ourselves and like Homo habilis and the Australopithecines. You compare Ardipithecus and Orarin and Sahelanthropus, and you can see the slow pushback of our face, which is neotenic, because we look very much like baby chimps. Baby chimps, their face is not very protruding, but it protrudes as they grow. So we trended towards looking more like a baby, essentially, and so that's why our face is the way that it is.
So you believe that?
We can show that that's what happened.
Have you ever heard of a doctor? No. If you could show, if you could actually show that that's what happened, there would be no question about evolution.
There isn't a question. Again, among scientists, there is no question. The question is among creationists.
It's been taught as a lie. It's not true.
So I'm going to go look up some technical literature, and then I can send you some.
Have you heard of Patterson or Colin Patterson?
Colin Patterson?
Colin, paleontologist.
Colin Patterson, you said? Paleontologist?
Yes.
I don't think so. I'm looking it up currently, or looking him up. Let me see if Colin was a British paleontologist. He advocated the transformed school of cladistics. Oh, are you going to make... I think I have... Can I guess? Are you about to quote him? Can I guess what your quote is?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Is it, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book? Is it that one?
No.
Is it in several animal and plant groups enough fossils? Fossils tell us many things, but one thing they can never disclose is whether there were any ancestors. Is it that one?
No.
Okay, well, read me the quote, please.
Okay. He says that, this is just kind of breaking into the quote. He says, one morning I woke up and it struck me that I had been working on this stuff, that is, evolution, 50 years. And there was not one thing I knew about it, he added. That was quite a shock to be misled for so long. I've tried putting a simple question to people. Can you tell me anything you know about evolution? Any one thing that you think is true? I tried that question on the geology staff in the Field Museum of Natural History, and the only answer I got was silence. I tried it on the members of the evolutionary morphology seminar in the University of Chicago, and all I got there was silence for a long time. Yes, I know one thing. It ought not be taught in high school.
I'm trying to, because I'm...
He said,
yeah.
I said, I seem fated continually to make a fool of myself with creationists. I hope that by now I have learned to be better in dealing with them.
I've heard that one.
Yeah. He says, it is easy for us to make up stories how we rise to another, and to find reasons why the stages should be favored by, but it's part of the science, for there is no way of putting them to the test.
So I'm going to have to take the quotes at face value because I'm not fast enough to type in everything that you said.
Let me tell you this. Let me say this. You are obviously a very intelligent young man. I'm very, you have read and what you have studied. But unfortunately, what you're going to find is that if you do not seek the truth text, and if you do not seek the truth of Jesus Christ as Lord and Creator, you're going to exhale your last, and you're going to find that everything you studied and everything you believed has come to futility, and that you're going to find that our Creator created mankind. There wasn't a simple genome that mutated and became all that we see. That the sun didn't get ignited by accident. The moon is not rotating by accident. The earth is not rotating by accident. And man is not here by accident. That we each have a purpose, that we each have a soul, and that we were each created after the living God for a specific reason. And we are in the midst of that reason. And I don't want to take up your time right now explaining that in detail, but God knew, and He has a plan for me. And evolution is a lie from the pit of hell. And the reason evolution came about and that it was infused into our public schools, that because beginning with John Dewey, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, these progressives searched, and they wanted a way of changing the hearts and minds of the American public from its foundation in Christianity to one of basic nihilism, of naturalism, so that our youth could be programmed and taught things away from and into a progressive society. They wanted religion, they wanted Christianity completely eradicated. In 1962, they were successful through Madalyn Murray O'Hair and getting through the of England. They got Jesus Christ taken out of our public schools in 1962. 1 year later, they infused Darwinian evolutionary theory into our public schools.
That's not how that happened.
That is how it happened.
No, actually, evolution had been in the schools for years prior to that point.
They taught young men that you're the product of pond scum, that a creator, that life has no value. And that is why we have given birth to 2 to 3 generations of millennials and young people who are staunch atheist, naturalist, and nihilist. And you have been brainwashed. You have been taught complete bunk. And it is all an agenda to change you into a progressive socialist. And they have been very successful. And I feel sorry.
I personally don't like socialism at all. I'm not a socialist. I don't like socialism.
Well, many.
Most people I know don't like socialism. No, actually, I know very few. I can count the number of. What socialism is. I mean, you're probably right on that, but I can count the number of people I know who I know personally who positively identify themselves as socialist on one hand, on one finger, is one person I've ever. I don't know anyone else who identifies personally as a socialist.
Our schools, our nation is progressively becoming socialist.
Okay, so let me make. So I want to put this. For the viewers out there, I want to put this whole conversation in context. You have not cited any technical literature on anything we've talked about. You've actively denied the existence of technical literature. And when I've told you about technical literature, you've just said it doesn't exist. right? The tests, the data, the inferences that people have made. These all exist, and they're at your fingertips. You personally can go look these things up anytime you want, but I think you're choosing not to.
I'm telling you, it's a lie. It never happened. It is simply an inference. You have been fed lies. You have been brainwashed into an evolutionary dogma. It is a religion that you have become.
But you haven't been brainwashed, right? I'm sure you haven't been brainwashed. You haven't?
No.
Oh, how convenient.
No, why?
It's only me.
No.
Yeah, okay.
I'm telling you that you have been brainwashed. You cannot even explain origin.
Okay, I've given
I can
you.
Explain.
I've told you, even if I can't explain origins of life, which I've already admitted to, because there's no problem admitting that, all the data for evolution, which you have categorically denied exists, doesn't go away. I encourage you, stop reading creationists. Actually look, if you want to know what an evolutionist thinks, ask an evolutionist. Don't ask an apologist, because they are going to mislead you. What?
Evolutionists don't think. Evolutionists don't think. All they do is what they've been told to puppet.
Okay, so
you're
that's a
not
conspiracy,
thinking.
Essentially. You have no evidence for any of the claims that you've made. You've admitted you don't have any evidence for any of the claims that you've made. I've provided links in the chat. I provided a link in the chat. You have provided no evidence. So please don't pick up the Bible, because the Bible is not evidence. The Bible's a claim.
The Bible is evidence, as is John Dewey's statement, as Woodrow Wilson's statement.
Quotes are not evidence. If I quote to you 100 scientists who say they accept evolution, are you going to accept evolution? If I quote to you a creationist who says that evolution works, are you going to? Then why do you think it matters? Why do you think it matters? I can quote to a creationist. I can quote a creationist who thinks evolution happened. Todd Wood taught that there is evidence. No, he's a creationist.
Doesn't mean that he is a
Christian in Genesis. He is a Christian. He says the reason he rejects evolution is not on evidence; it's on faith alone. He says that. That's what he says.
Well, my faith is that the Genesis is accurate. He
believes that.
Yours is that we somehow just popped into existence from non-living matter. I'm going to go with the Holy Spirit,
what I think.
Who was there. I'm going to go with the Holy Spirit. Well, that's what the foundation
of out of nowhere from non-living matter. That's not what. That's a complete straw man of my position. Why don't you?
Why don't you demand evolution?
No, it doesn't. So okay, I encourage you. I really do encourage you to, instead of asking for apologists what they think about evolution, ask evolutionists. Heck, just go to Wikipedia, for goodness sakes.
Listen to me. This is why it's important. This is why it's important. And let me tell you, Jackson, after 31 years in law enforcement, I have a pretty good perception of good and evil, right and wrong. And you're a good guy. I don't have a whole lot to do. They rub me wrong, but I like you. And let me tell you why this really matters, is because you are here for a purpose, a specific, and the primary purpose of this life, Jackson, is to prepare for. That is the only reason that you and I are here. You're going to die in this body, but you are infused with a spirit that is not to die. It is going to transition into the spiritual realm. And if you continue in this path that you're following, Jackson, you're not in God's kingdom. He has fastened you. He has fashioned you.
You're not a once saved, always saved person?
Has molded. No. When I say once saved, always saved,
Darn.
If a person is truly saved, they don't fall away to the end, because a person that is truly saved is born again by the Holy Spirit. If you are infused with the Holy Spirit, you're not going to fall away. You are first. Now, there are a lot of people. In fact, the Lord has said many people Jesus as their Lord, but they really their heart of the life, nor did they receive the Spirit themselves as Christians, but they're not. There's a lot of people out here in our world that for one reason or another, but they're not, Jackson.
Okay.
And the reason it matters is because I don't want to see you lose. And this history that you're following is guiding you away from the truth. It is that is going to end up causing you to, and it is so important. If you your trust in Jesus Christ as your Lord, not believe that He is God who died for you for the forgiveness of sin, you're going to lose your soul, Jack. Is that important? Is that important?
What I am going to say is that this is, I do need to hop off, and I do appreciate that you've come on here for a conversation with me. I thank you very much, and I thank you, audience, for everyone being here. So,
thank you.
Yes, again, thanks again, Mr. Rick, for coming on, and for everybody else. All right, well, I'll see everybody else probably at 9 p.m. That's in about 3 hours on the Modern Day Hysteria's channel. I'll be debating Kent Hovind if you don't already know, so go check that out later. So anyway, thanks everybody. I'll talk to you later.